September 12, 1943, 0530 hours. Captain Hideaki Tanaka stands on the bridge of the destroyer Hayate, watching the dawn break over the Arafura Sea with the kind of confidence that comes from sailing waters his navy has controlled without serious challenge for nearly 2 years. Behind his flagship, 6 destroyers escort 11 transport vessels carrying the Imperial Army's 41st Infantry Division, over 8,000 soldiers desperately needed by General Hisaichi Terauchi at Hollandia. The morning air is thick with humidity, and Tanaka can taste salt on his lips as he surveys his perfectly aligned convoy. Everything appears routine. Everything feels safe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Captain Tanaka doesn't know, what he cannot possibly imagine as he sips his morning tea and reviews the navigation charts, is that mechanics at a remote airfield in Darwin have spent the last 4 months transforming twin-engine fighters into something the world has never seen before. Within 3 hours, modified P-38 Lightning fighters carrying clusters of forward-firing cannons will scream out of the clouds at 400 miles per hour, and his carefully organized convoy will become a graveyard of twisted steel and burning oil that stretches for miles across these supposedly secure waters. The Japanese Navy's sense of security isn't built on arrogance but on hard-earned experience. Captain Tanaka himself has commanded escort missions along this route 17 times since June of 1942. And while American submarines occasionally pose threats beneath the surface, aerial attacks have proven manageable, almost predictable in their execution. High-altitude bombers from Port Moresby attempt their runs regularly, but hitting a maneuvering ship from 20,000 feet requires more luck than skill, and Tanaka's gunners have become expert at throwing up enough flak to scatter bomber formations before they can achieve proper aim. Commander Shiro Matsumoto, directing operations aboard the destroyer Isokase, has trained his anti-aircraft crews to respond to threats with mechanical precision. His men know the American playbook by heart. B-17 formations approaching from altitude, requiring several minutes of steady flight before bomb release, giving destroyers ample time to execute evasive patterns. Torpedo bombers making their slow, vulnerable approaches at wave-top level, presenting perfect targets for concentrated machine gun fire. Even the occasional fighter sweep can be weathered with disciplined defensive fire and tight formation sailing. The convoy has practiced these responses until they've become second nature, and Matsumoto feels certain his ships can handle whatever the Americans throw at them during this 2-day journey to Hollandia. The transport vessels themselves represent a massive commitment of resources. The largest, Kirishima Maru, displaces nearly 7,000 tons and carries an entire regiment packed into holds designed for cargo, not humans. The soldiers have been briefed about potential air attacks, but they've also been assured that Japanese naval superiority in these waters remains absolute. Most of these men are veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya, hardened soldiers who've faced artillery and machine gun fire without flinching, yet none of them can imagine the horror that awaits when aircraft weaponry evolves beyond anything their commanders have prepared them for. Lieutenant Kenji Hayashi, commanding the destroyer Akazuki's anti-aircraft batteries, represents the new generation of Japanese naval officers who've grown up with aerial warfare as a constant reality. He's studied every report from Pearl Harbor, from the Philippines, from the Java Sea, absorbing lessons about coordination between ships, about timing and deflection when firing at fast-moving targets, about maintaining discipline when under attack. His gun crews have drilled relentlessly with the Type 96 25mm cannons, learning to track targets smoothly, to lead their shots properly, to work as unified teams rather than individual gunners. These weapons, combined with the heavier 127mm dual-purpose guns mounted on the destroyers, create what Japanese tactical doctrine describes as an impenetrable shield of steel and explosive shells capable of shredding any aircraft foolish enough to approach within effective range. But doctrine written in peacetime offices in Tokyo, based on assumptions about how aircraft will behave and what weapons they'll carry, is about to collide with American innovation born from desperation and unconventional thinking. The P-38 Lightning, originally designed as a high-altitude interceptor and escort fighter, has caught the attention of engineers and combat pilots who see potential far beyond its original purpose. Colonel James Whitlock, commanding the 8th Fighter Group operating from advanced bases near Darwin, has spent months watching conventional bombing raids achieve minimal results against Japanese shipping, and he's convinced that fighters, with their speed and maneuverability, could deliver devastating attacks if properly equipped and if pilots are willing to take enormous risks. Working alongside civilian contractor Michael Harrison, formerly an engineer with Lockheed, Whitlock begins experimenting with modifications that turn the P-38's distinctive twin-boom design into an advantage rather than just an identifying characteristic. The aircraft's nose, traditionally housing a 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, becomes the focus of radical redesign. Harrison's team removes internal equipment deemed non-essential for short-range attack missions, creating space for additional ammunition storage and reinforced mounting points. The final configuration mounts two 20mm cannons and 8.50 caliber machine guns, all firing forward in a concentrated cone of destruction that no single-engine fighter could possibly match. The engineering challenges prove substantial. Each 20mm cannon weighs 94 pounds and fires at a rate of 600 rounds per minute, while the .50 caliber guns add another 64 pounds each with their 850 rounds per minute cyclic rate. The combined weight of these weapons, plus ammunition loads of 300 rounds per cannon and 500 rounds per machine gun, requires careful recalculation of the aircraft's center of gravity and structural reinforcement throughout the nose section. Harrison's team works through tropical nights in improvised workshops, fabricating mounting brackets from scrap metal, routing ammunition feeds through confined spaces, and testing fire control systems until they achieve reliability even during violent combat maneuvering. The true genius of the P-38 gunship concept emerges when Whitlock combines the heavy forward armament with a radical new attack profile that exploits the aircraft's speed and structural strength. Traditional fighter attacks on ships involve diving approaches followed by strafing runs, but these tactics expose aircraft to sustained anti-aircraft fire and rarely achieve decisive damage. Whitlock develops what he calls the hammer strike approach, where P-38s approach their targets at extremely low altitude, using speed and the curvature of the Earth to remain undetected until the last possible moment, then pour concentrated fire into a single ship for 8 to 10 seconds before breaking away at maximum speed. The key lies in overwhelming a target's defenses so quickly that gunners have no time to respond effectively. The 20mm cannons fire high-explosive incendiary rounds that detonate on impact, creating fist-sized holes in steel plating and starting fires wherever they strike. The .50 caliber machine guns deliver armor-piercing incendiary rounds capable of penetrating destroyer deck armor and killing exposed personnel with horrifying efficiency. When all 10 guns fire simultaneously, they create a stream of destruction unlike anything the Japanese Navy has encountered, a literal river of explosive projectiles that can saw through a ship's superstructure in seconds, destroy bridge equipment, kill command personnel, and leave vessels burning and out of control before their crews understand what's happening. Training for these hammer strike missions requires pilots to overcome every instinct that tells them to maintain altitude and distance from enemy fire. Captain David Morrison, leading the 80th Fighter Squadron's conversion to the gunship role, drills his pilots relentlessly on low-altitude navigation, teaching them to read wave patterns and use islands for concealment, to time their approaches for maximum surprise, to maintain steady aim despite knowing that hundreds of guns will soon be shooting back at them. The pilots practice against hulks anchored off Darwin, learning to judge range and deflection, discovering that opening fire at 1,200 yards gives them enough time to walk their streams of tracers onto target while maintaining speed that makes them difficult targets themselves. The psychological preparation proves as important as the technical training. These pilots must fly directly toward ships bristling with anti-aircraft weapons, must hold their course while tracers reach toward them like deadly fingers, must trust that their speed and the concentration of their own firepower will carry them through the defensive barrage. Morrison loses 2 aircraft during training accidents, grim reminders that low-altitude flying over water leaves no margin for error, but the surviving pilots develop a fierce confidence in their modified Lightnings and in tactics that promise to revolutionize anti-shipping warfare. By early September 1943, Whitlock has 12 fully modified P-38 gunships operational, with crews trained and tactics refined through months of practice. Intelligence reports indicate increased Japanese convoy activity along the northern New Guinea coast, and reconnaissance flights detect a major formation departing Rabaul on September 10, steering southwest toward Hollandia. The convoy's size and composition suggest it carries significant troop reinforcements, making it a priority target for Allied forces desperate to prevent Japanese forces in New Guinea from receiving supplies and fresh soldiers. The attack plan comes together with military precision and calculated audacity. 16 P-38 gunships will form the primary strike force, approaching from the southeast at wave-top height to avoid radar detection for as long as possible. 8 conventional P-38 fighters will sweep ahead, clearing any Japanese patrol aircraft from the area and drawing attention away from the gunships. 4 B-24 Liberator bombers will approach from high altitude, not to bomb but to force the convoy's anti-aircraft guns to train skyward, creating the perfect moment for the low-altitude assault. The entire operation depends on timing, coordination, and the element of surprise that comes from using weapons the enemy doesn't know exist. Captain Tanaka receives his first indication that something unusual is developing at 0812 hours when lookouts report aircraft contacts to the south, high-altitude bombers that appear to be forming up for a standard attack run. He orders the convoy into defensive formation, with destroyers moving to positions that create overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire while transport vessels execute gentle evasive turns designed to complicate bombing solutions. This is exactly what his crews have trained for, and Tanaka feels confident as he watches his ships respond with practiced efficiency. His radar operators track the approaching B-24s, calculating their speed and altitude, providing data to fire control teams who begin adjusting gun elevations and preparing to engage the moment the bombers enter effective range. What radar cannot show Tanaka, what his lookouts cannot see because they're scanning the skies for high-altitude threats, is 12 P-38 gunships racing toward his convoy at 350 miles per hour, their propeller hubs churning spray from wave tops, their pilots' hands steady on control columns as they close the distance to their targets. Captain Morrison leads the formation in his aircraft, Devil's Advocate, its nose painted with the image of a grinning demon surrounded by flames. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Fletcher in Hellfire, flies so close that Morrison can see Fletcher's face through the canopy, jaw set with determination and probably fear, though neither man will admit to feeling anything but professional focus as they approach what will become the most intense combat either has ever experienced. At 6 miles from the convoy, Morrison begins his final approach briefing over the radio, his voice calm despite his racing pulse. Primary targets are the destroyers on the convoy's southern edge, the vessels that pose the greatest threat to subsequent attack runs. Each gunship pilot has been assigned a specific target, memorized its silhouette and characteristics, knows exactly where to aim for maximum effect. Morrison's target is the destroyer Hayate, Captain Tanaka's flagship, a vessel whose destruction will decapitate the convoy's command structure and create chaos throughout the Japanese formation. The B-24s begin their bombing run at 0817 hours, and immediately every Japanese gun barrel swings skyward, commanders shouting orders, crews training weapons on the high-altitude threat exactly as doctrine demands. Captain Tanaka watches the Liberators through his binoculars, calculating their approach angle and estimating time to bomb release, confident his ships will maneuver clear of whatever falls from those distant aircraft. His attention, like that of every Japanese sailor in the convoy, is focused upward on the obvious threat, on the bombers everyone can see approaching from 20,000 feet. Nobody is watching the horizon to the south. Nobody sees the 12 dark shapes that suddenly materialize from the morning haze, growing larger with impossible speed. The first Japanese sailor to spot the P-38s is a young seaman named Takeshi Ito, assigned to portside watch aboard the transport Hokkaido Maru, and his scream of warning comes too late to matter because even as he's pointing and shouting, Morrison's guns are already firing. The distance between Morrison's P-38 and the destroyer Hayate closes with terrifying speed as his finger tightens on the trigger. At 1,000 yards, he opens fire, and the concentrated blast from two 20mm cannons and 8 machine guns creates a visible stream of tracers that reaches across the water like a bridge made of light and death. the effect on Hayate is immediate and catastrophic. The bridge windows disintegrate in a cascade of razor-sharp glass fragments that slice through anyone standing near them. Captain Tanaka, who had been focused on the high-altitude bombers through his binoculars, feels something hot tear through his left shoulder and turns to see his navigation officer collapse with most of his chest torn away by a 20mm explosive round. The concentrated firepower from Morrison's guns walks from bow to stern across Hayate's superstructure, each impact creating small eruptions of sparks and smoke. The 20mm rounds punch through the thin plating that shields the bridge, detonating inside with devastating effect. Control equipment shatters. Communications panels explode in showers of electrical sparks. Men who have served together for months are reduced to broken bodies in seconds as the armor-piercing rounds tear through flesh and bone with equal ease. Tanaka tries to shout orders, but the roar of exploding ammunition and the screaming of dying men drowns out his voice. His ship, which moments ago had been a perfectly functioning warship, is rapidly becoming a slaughterhouse. Morrison holds his firing run for 9 seconds, pouring over 1,100 rounds into Hayate before breaking left and climbing away, his aircraft shuddering from the recoil of all 10 guns firing simultaneously. As he banks, he sees smoke pouring from multiple points along the destroyer's length, sees bodies sprawled across the deck, sees the ship beginning a slow turn to port because there's nobody left alive at the helm to maintain course. Behind him, Lieutenant Fletcher in Hellfire is already making his approach on the destroyer Isokase, and Morrison can see the tracers from Fletcher's guns stitching a line of destruction across that ship's forward section. Commander Matsumoto aboard Isokase has perhaps 5 seconds of warning before Fletcher's attack begins. He sees Morrison's P-38 pulling away from Hayate and starts to turn toward this new threat when Fletcher's guns open up at 900 yards. The closer range means even greater accuracy, and Matsumoto watches in frozen horror as the stream of fire walks directly toward his bridge. He tries to dive for cover, but there is no cover from this kind of firepower. The 20mm rounds tear through the bridge bulkheads as if they were paper, and Matsumoto's last conscious thought is a confused recognition that warfare has changed in ways he never anticipated. The gunships work in pairs, each team selecting their target with clinical precision. Lieutenant Robert Chen in Wrath leads his wingman against the destroyer Akazuki, catching her as she tries to turn her anti-aircraft batteries toward the low-flying attackers. Chen's opening burst silences 3 of the destroyer's 25mm gun positions in the first 2 seconds, the explosive rounds detonating among the gun crews and turning trained sailors into casualties before they can fire a shot in response. His wingman, Captain Sarah Martinez in fury, follows immediately behind, her guns concentrating on Akazuki's aft section where the ship's depth charge racks present a tempting target. Martinez's 20mm rounds find the depth charges with predictable results. The explosions that follow are far larger than anything her guns alone could produce, as multiple depth charges detonate in rapid sequence, the blasts tearing away Akazuki's entire stern section. The destroyer's back breaks under the force of the explosions, and she begins settling by the stern almost immediately, her propellers still turning uselessly as water floods into her engineering spaces through the massive holes blown in her hull. Lieutenant Kenji Hayashi, the young anti-aircraft officer who had been so confident in his training and his gun crews, finds himself standing on a tilting deck surrounded by wreckage and bodies. His carefully drilled teams are gone, killed in the first seconds of an attack they never saw coming. He tries to organize damage control parties, but there's no controlling damage of this magnitude. Akazuki is dying, and Hayashi knows it with the certainty that comes from seeing water rising through deck gratings that should be dry. He gives the order to abandon ship, though he's not certain anyone hears him over the roar of continuing explosions and the screech of tearing metal. The transport vessels, slower and more vulnerable than the destroyers, become easy prey as the P-38 gunships shift their attention to the larger targets. Captain William Chang in Vengeance selects the transport Kurashima Maru, the largest vessel in the convoy, and approaches from her starboard quarter at full throttle. The transport's defensive armament consists of a few light machine guns, utterly inadequate against an aircraft mounting 10 forward-firing weapons. Chang opens fire at 1,500 yards, and his sustained burst systematically destroys the bridge, the forward cargo hatches, and the lifeboat stations along the ship's side. Inside Kurashima Maru's holds, 800 soldiers of the 41st Infantry Division experience a new definition of helplessness. These are men who have faced Chinese artillery, who have survived jungle combat in Malaya, who consider themselves hardened veterans of brutal warfare. But nothing in their experience has prepared them for being trapped in a steel box while explosive rounds tear through the deck above their heads. The 20mm shells that penetrate into the cargo holds detonate among packed bodies, each explosion killing or maiming multiple men. Fire breaks out almost immediately as incendiary components ignite stored supplies and wooden dunnage used to secure cargo. Sergeant Major Hiroshi Nakamura, a veteran of the China campaigns with 17 years of service, tries to maintain order among his men as smoke begins filling the hold. He can hear the screaming of wounded soldiers mixed with the roar of aircraft engines and the terrifying sound of metal tearing. When he tries to lead men toward the ladders that provide the only exit from the hold, he finds the hatches jammed shut, warped by the impacts and fires above. The realization that they're trapped spreads through the soldiers faster than the smoke, and Nakamura can only hold position and try to keep his men from panicking as the temperature rises and breathing becomes increasingly difficult. Chang makes 3 passes on Kurashima Maru, each run adding more damage to the accumulating destruction. By his final pass, the transport is listing heavily to starboard, multiple fires burning out of control, and clearly doomed. He shifts his attention to a smaller transport, Nagoya Maru, whose captain has made the fatal error of trying to turn away from the attack, presenting his ship's full length as a target. Chang's guns walk from stern to bow, methodically destroying everything in their path. The bridge disintegrates under the concentrated fire. The engine room takes multiple hits that kill the engineering crew and start fires among fuel lines. Within 2 minutes of Chang's first shot, Nagoya Maru is dead in the water, listing and burning. The Japanese attempt to mount organized resistance proves futile against the speed and firepower of the P-38 gunships. The few anti-aircraft guns that manage to engage the attackers find their targets moving too fast and too unpredictably to track effectively. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine assumes targets that maintain steady courses for bombing runs, giving gunners time to calculate deflection and elevation. The P-38s make single passes at maximum speed, firing for seconds before breaking away in violent evasive maneuvers that make tracking nearly impossible. The result is that Japanese gunners find themselves shooting at empty air while their own ships are being systematically destroyed around them. Aboard the destroyer Hamikase, Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Tanabe watches 3 of his sister ships burning or sinking and realizes that his vessel may be the convoy's only hope for mounting any kind of defense. He orders maximum speed and steers toward the approaching P-38s, hoping to position his ship between the attackers and the remaining transports. It's a brave gesture but ultimately pointless. 2 gunships, flown by Captains James Wu in Thunder and Lisa Torres in Lightning, spot Hamikaze's maneuver and coordinate their attack with practiced efficiency. Wu approaches from the starboard bow while Torres comes in from the port quarter, creating a crossfire that Hamikaze's gunners cannot possibly counter. Wu's opening burst destroys the forward gun turret and kills everyone in the bridge, including Tanabe, whose final act is a futile attempt to grab the helm as 20mm rounds tear through the compartment. Torres's attack focuses on the destroyer's midship section, her guns finding the torpedo mounts and creating secondary explosions that blow massive holes in Hamikaze's side. The destroyer, suddenly without command and control, losing speed as her engine rooms flood, becomes just another piece of wreckage in the growing debris field. The attack reaches its crescendo as all 12 gunships are engaged simultaneously, creating a scene of such concentrated destruction that survivors will struggle to describe it coherently. The sea becomes a churning mass of explosions, burning oil, and sinking ships. The air fills with smoke so thick that pilots have difficulty distinguishing targets. Tracers crisscross in every direction as Japanese gunners fire desperately at aircraft they can barely see. The noise becomes overwhelming, a continuous roar of engines, gunfire, explosions, and the grinding screech of dying ships. Captain Morrison, having reformed his flight after the initial attack, makes a second run through the chaos. His target this time is the transport Hokkaido Maru, which has somehow survived the initial assault with only minor damage. Morrison approaches from dead ahead, flying directly up the ship's centerline, his guns firing continuously. The effect is like cutting the ship in half lengthwise. Bridge, masts, lifeboats, cargo handling equipment, all disintegrate under the concentrated fire. Morrison's 20mm rounds punch through the thin deck plating and detonate in the cargo holds below, starting fires that quickly spread out of control. Young seaman Takeshi Ito, who had been first to spot the approaching P-38s, finds himself in the water surrounded by debris and bodies, wondering how he survived when so many others didn't. He watches Hokkaido Maru burning above him, sees men jumping from her decks only to be struck by falling debris or pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship. He tries to swim away from the wreck but finds his strength failing rapidly. The water, which had seemed warm when he first entered it, now feels cold, and he realizes dimly that he's probably going into shock. The transport Osaka Maru attempts to flee at maximum speed, her captain abandoning any pretense of maintaining formation in favor of simple survival. The attempt fails when 3 P-38s catch her in the open water. The concentrated fire from 30 guns turns the ship into an inferno in less than a minute. Her fuel tanks rupture and ignite, creating a fireball that rises hundreds of feet into the air. Soldiers trapped below decks have no chance of escape, and those on deck face the choice between burning or drowning. Most choose the water, but few survive the flames that spread across the oil-covered surface. By 0840 hours, 23 minutes after Morrison fired the first shot, the battle is effectively over. Of the 11 transport vessels that sailed from Rabaul, all are sinking, sunk, or burning uncontrollably. Of the 7 destroyers, 5 are lost and the remaining 2 are so heavily damaged they can barely maintain headway. The 41st Infantry Division has effectively ceased to exist, its 8,000 soldiers either dead or drowning in waters suddenly turned hostile. The supplies and equipment intended for Hollandia rest on the seafloor or burn in scattered wreckage across miles of ocean. Captain Tanaka, badly wounded but still alive, stands on what remains of Hayate's bridge and tries to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. His flagship is sinking, though slowly enough that survivors might be rescued if help arrives soon. Around him, the sea is covered with debris, bodies, and scattered groups of survivors clinging to wreckage. The carefully organized convoy he had been so confident about protecting has become a scene of devastation that exceeds anything in his worst nightmares. He tries to issue orders, but his radio equipment is destroyed, his subordinate commanders are mostly dead, and the survivors are focused entirely on their own immediate survival. The P-38 gunships, their ammunition expended and fuel running low, form up and turn back toward Darwin. The pilots are quiet on the radio during the return flight, processing what they've just done and seen. Morrison runs through the mission in his mind, analyzing what worked and what could be improved, but part of him is simply trying to comprehend the scale of destruction 12 aircraft achieved in less than half an hour. He's seen combat before, has shot down enemy fighters and strafed ground targets, but nothing in his experience compares to watching an entire convoy destroyed in minutes. Lieutenant Fletcher breaks radio silence as they approach the Australian coast, his voice subdued. He reports 2 hits from anti-aircraft fire, both superficial, and confirms all 12 gunships are returning safely. The cost to American forces is negligible compared to the devastation inflicted on the Japanese convoy. This disparity will become a central theme in the subsequent tactical analysis, as military planners recognize that they've discovered a form of attack that achieves overwhelming results with minimal risk to attackers. The survivors of the convoy face a desperate struggle in the hours following the attack. The 2 damaged destroyers attempt rescue operations, but their own damage limits their effectiveness. Hundreds of men, many wounded or burned, cling to wreckage in water that grows rougher as the day progresses. Some are picked up by the destroyers. Others are left behind when the warships must withdraw to avoid being caught by follow-up attacks. Japanese submarines arriving after nightfall rescue perhaps 200 more, but the majority of those who survived the initial attack perish in the water over the following hours and days. Lieutenant Hayashi, the young anti-aircraft officer from Akizuki, survives by clinging to a floating hatch cover for 7 hours before being picked up by a submarine. He spends the time reviewing everything he thought he knew about aerial warfare and realizing that his training, his doctrine, his entire understanding of how ships defend against aircraft, has been rendered obsolete in 23 minutes of combat. When he's finally pulled from the water, exhausted and borderline hypothermic, his first question to the submarine captain is whether anyone understands how to fight against these new American gunships. The answer, as senior Japanese naval officers will discover over the following weeks, is that there is no effective defense. The speed of the P-38s combined with their devastating firepower creates an attack profile that traditional anti-aircraft weapons cannot counter. By the time gunners acquire their targets, the aircraft have already fired and are breaking away. The forward-firing armament means the P-38s need only point their noses at a target and pull the trigger, requiring far less skill than traditional strafing or bombing. The psychological effect proves equally devastating, as Japanese sailors come to dread the sight of twin-boom silhouettes approaching at wave-top height. Admiral Manichi Koga, who assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death, receives the report of the convoy's destruction with visible distress. The loss of 8,000 trained soldiers represents a significant blow to Japanese ground forces in New Guinea, but the broader implications worry him more. If the Americans can destroy convoys with such ease, how can Japan possibly maintain its far-flung garrisons? The Navy's primary mission includes protecting supply lines, and if that mission has become impossible, then Japan's strategic position throughout the Pacific is fundamentally untenable. Koga orders an immediate review of all convoy operations and anti-aircraft defenses, but the reviewing officers struggle to develop recommendations that address the new threat. Adding more light anti-aircraft guns helps marginally but cannot overcome the fundamental problem of targets that approach too fast and fire too accurately to be stopped by traditional defenses. Some officers suggest sailing only at night, but this reduces operational flexibility and still leaves convoys vulnerable to aircraft equipped with radar. The reality that emerges from these reviews is that Japanese surface vessels can no longer operate safely within range of American bases, effectively ceding control of vast ocean areas. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.